Hi, this is Sharon McDowell Larson from the Center for Creative Leadership, and this is part one of a two-part series talking about the possible role that food can play in either promoting cancer and increasing our risk or decreasing our risk for cancer. And so in part one, we're going to talk about foods that are harmful, foods that might help promote cancer. And I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, have been affected some way by this disease. You've either known someone who's had cancer or perhaps you've had it yourself. Indeed, it is a widespread disease and the odds of getting cancer are quite high. In fact, if you're a male in the US, you have almost a 50% chance of getting cancer in your lifetime, and if you're a female, you have almost a 40% chance of getting cancer. In Western countries, it is the second leading cause of death, and according to the World Health Organization, in their World Cancer Report that they published in 2009, they said that the global cancer burden has doubled in the last 30 years. It is estimated that this will double again by the year 2020 and nearly triple by the year 2030. Heart disease, as you may know, is the leading cause of death worldwide, and it is, by comparison, a little bit more straightforward and perhaps far less devious. We know that the causative factor is elevated cholesterol, and in particular elevated LDL cholesterol, and that it's exacerbated by stress, smoking, obesity, hypertension, and diabetes, lack of exercise, and so on. And according to Dr. Roberts, the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Cardiology, elevated LDL and atherosclerosis is infrequently hereditary in origin, that most of us get this disease because we consume too many calories, too much fat, too much cholesterol, and too much trans fat. And he goes on to say that in order to prevent this disease from occurring, or if we want to try to reverse this disease, that we need to eat a predominantly vegetarian starch-based diet. And indeed, numerous studies by Ornish and Esselstyn have definitively shown that heart disease can in fact be reversed by changing one's diet to a whole foods, plant-based diet. But what about cancer? How much of a role do genetics play? How much of a role does food play? But first, some interesting statistics. In 1971, Nixon signed into law the National Cancer Act in order to more effectively carry out the national effort against cancer. And this came to be known as the start of the war on cancer. But in the 40-plus years since, progress in reducing the overall cancer mortality has been disappointing at best. While mortality has actually declined in some cancers by about 1% on average, unfortunately the more common cancers have actually been increasing by about the same amount. So it's been about a net zero gain in spite of spending billions of dollars. And 5 cancers actually account for 62% of all cancer deaths in men and women. And the big 5 are prostate, breast, lung, colorectal, and pancreatic cancers. But to address the role of diet, genes, and other lifestyle factors, I want to start with this review that was published in 2008. And as the title suggests, cancer is a preventable disease. I like the word preventable because as important as finding a cure is, the better bet is to avoid getting it in the first place. So let's take a look at what the paper says are the contributing factors. So according to the paper, they estimate that only 5 to 10% of cancers are in fact of genetic origin. I've heard other estimates say that this might actually be 2 to 3%. But either way, it's a pretty low number. So the good news is that for the most part, we're not at the mercy of our genes. The bad news is that we can no longer blame our parents. So when we look at the environmental factors, these account for 90 to 95% of all cancers. And when we break these out, we find that diet accounts for the largest proportion, followed by tobacco use, obesity, certain infections such as human papillomavirus or HIV viruses, other environmental contaminants, and excess alcohol use. So for the most part, this is what we do to ourselves. But this is for all cancers combined. And when we look at the big 5, what we find is that diet actually accounts for almost over 50% of many of these cancers, with, of course, the exception of lung cancer, which, as you know, is caused by cigarette smoking. So let's talk about foods and what foods might promote cancer and what might help reduce our risk. So here we have some foods, and see if you can guess which foods are helpful and which foods might be harmful. So we have soy products like tofu, salmon, cruciferous vegetables such as broccoli, dairy products, seeds such as flax and chia seeds, mushrooms, green pepper, legumes such as lentils and beans, eggs, berries, garlic and onions, and finally bacon. So make your guesses, and then we'll review this at the end and we can see how many you get correct. When it comes to the process of how we get cancer, obviously it's a very complex disease. But on a very basic level, this is generally what happens. So here we have a healthy cell with a healthy DNA. And it can get exposed to carcinogens or reactive oxygen species, otherwise known as free radicals. We create these free radicals as a result of aerobic metabolism or by exposure to certain contaminants. So when the cell gets exposed to these, the DNA can get damaged. Once the DNA is damaged, one of three things can happen. Oftentimes the cell will just heal itself, correct the problem, or it'll commit cellular suicide. It'll self-destruct. And this is known as apoptosis. And as we're going to talk about in part 2, there are certain foods that can actually promote death of cancer cells, or apoptosis. But every once in a while, the cell will start to divide and double in number. And once this happens, the damaged DNA stays fixated in the progeny of the parent cell. So in other words, the damaged DNA continues to get passed on. At this point, the cells can continue to divide and double in number, and there's certain growth factors such as insulin-like growth factor or hormones such as estrogen, which can help promote this process. And we're going to talk about foods that can help stimulate the production of estrogen, of insulin-like growth factor, or foods that provide us with estrogen. And in part 2, we're going to talk about foods that might actually inhibit or help prevent this. So as the cells continue to divide and double in number, eventually we get to about 1 billion cells in size. And at this point, it is now detectable on a screen. Now, when the tumor gets to the size of 1 cubic millimeters, it cannot continue to survive without a proper vascular supply. So what the tumor does is secrete what we call angiogenic factors, such as VEGF, or vascular endothelial growth factor, or platelet-derived growth factors, or angiogenin. And all these factors help the vessel to create blood vessels. They help the tumor to get a blood supply, create blood vessels, which can deliver blood and nutrients to the tumor in order for it to allow it to continue to grow and thrive. And as we'll learn in part 2, there are certain foods that can actually inhibit this process. So scientists talk about 3 phases of cancer. They talk about the initiation phase, the promotion phase, and the progression phase. And food can play a role in all 3 of these phases. So the initiation phase actually happens very quickly, just time enough for the carcinogen to be consumed, absorbed into the blood, transported into the cells, and bonded to DNA. And except for some rare incidences, this is considered to be irreversible. During the promotion stage, estimates are that the time it takes for a set of cells to divide and double in number can be anywhere from 25 days to 1,000 days. So depending on how quickly this, whether it's 1,000 days or 25 days, it can take anywhere from 2 years to 100 years before the cancer gets to the tumor stage or the progression stage. Okay. So you can see once it gets to 1 billion cells, 1 billion cells becomes 2 billion, then 4 billion, then 8 billion. And so things can go downhill pretty quickly from there. So no wonder it's a very frightening disease. So the promotion stage is likely where diet can play the biggest role, and this is the phase that can perhaps be reversible, or the progression can actually be slowed. But back to the 2008 paper. which talked about lifestyle factors for cancer. So what they did in this paper was they identified certain compounds that are pro-carcinogenic and certain compounds that are chemoprotectors, that help protect us. So the pro-carcinogenic compounds can be involved in the initiation, the promotion, and the progression stages. So in this part, we're going to talk about the pro-carcinogenic factors, and in part 2, we're going to talk about the chemoprotective factors. So let's take a look. Here are the pro-carcinogenic factors, things like hormones and dioxins and heavy metals and saturated fat. So where do we find these in our food supply? So starting with hormones, where do we find a good dose of hormones, particularly estrogens, in our diet? Well, many people tend to think of soy, particularly when you talk about estrogens, but in fact dairy is a bigger source. Okay, and we're going to talk about soy actually in part 2. So why dairy? Well, it's true that some cows are injected with hormones in order to keep them pregnant, increase milk production, but modern cows are actually genetically bred to produce more of these hormones as well. Okay, and so therefore, cow's milk contains large amounts of estrogens and progesterone. And if you think about it, milk is designed to be a growth promoter. It's used to grow very small baby cows into very, very large animals very, very quickly. Okay? So even organic milk is chock full of growth promoters and hormones, which certainly don't help the cancer process. And indeed, when we look at population studies, we find very strong correlations between milk consumption and certain types of cancers, in particular breast cancer, as well as prostate cancer. But to illustrate this a little bit further, this was a study that was done by Colin T. Campbell. And what he did was they took 2 groups of animals and they exposed them to the same dose of a carcinogen called aflatoxin. Aflatoxin causes liver cancer. So equal exposure, but 2 different diets. So the one group was fed a very low protein, milk protein diet. The other group was fed a 20% milk protein diet, which is comparable to what you would find in human populations. So when they looked at the tumor growth in these animals, they found very, very significant difference in the size and weight of the tumor in the 20% milk protein diet. So what tended to predict the size of the tumor was not the dose of the carcinogen, but rather the type of diet that was fed to the animals. And indeed, when they looked at the animals after 100 weeks, those on the low milk protein diet were all alive and well. Those on the 20% milk protein diet were all dead. So it doesn't take a statistician to figure out that this is statistically different. Okay? And they also repeated this with looking at plant proteins such as soy proteins or gluten protein, and didn't find the same tumor growth promotion on those proteins as they did for the milk proteins. All right, so arsenic, where do we find that in the diet? Well, it's predominantly found in chicken. They give it to chickens in order to fatten them up. And when we compare it to other foods, arsenic is also found in things like beef and milk and hot dogs and so on, but predominantly in chicken. And incidentally, the EPA allowable limit is about 10 parts per billion, so many of these foods contain 2 to 8 times the allowable limit. Moving on to dioxins and pesticides, where do we find these? Well, these are predominantly found in fish. Why fish? Well, unfortunately, the oceans and rivers and lakes have become the sewers of the world, so sooner or later everything gets washed down into these waterways, and so fish then become widely contaminated. And in this particular report, published in 2007, they said that 90% of the human body burden of these dioxins and PCBs were from animal origin, with meat, dairy, and fish products being the main contributors. This was a report that was published in 2010 by the European Food Safety Authority when they tested different foods. Indeed, fish was found to be the worst, followed by eggs, dairy, meat, and lowest on the food chain, plants. This was another study comparing salmon that was organic farmed, raised, or caught in the wild. And ironically enough, the organic was the worst, followed by the farmed, but even the wild salmon caught in Alaska had significant levels of these dioxin-like PCBs. All right, next we have trans fats, and I think most of you know where that comes from. If you look at a label and it says hydrogenated fat, put it back on the shelf. And hydrogenated fat is added to foods to increase their shelf life. When we look at the breakdown in the American diet, what we find is that cakes, cookies, and breads account for the largest proportion of trans fats. This is followed by meat and dairy. Now, it's not added to meat and dairy. Trans fats are actually found naturally in these foods. And in this case, natural doesn't mean healthy. And then other foods like very common in the American diet, margarine, French fries, shortening, and chips, and so on. Next, we have nitrates, and I think most people know that nitrates come from processed meats. Nitrates are converted into something called nitrosamines. Nitrosamines are potent carcinogens. Nitrosamines are actually the key ingredient in cigarette smoke. And we know from population studies that when we feed children hot dogs, they have 10 times the odds of developing childhood leukemia. In fact, in a 2007 study, a review of the 7,000 studies by the World Cancer Research Fund, they concluded that consumers should stop buying and eating all processed meat products for the rest of their lives. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Where do we find nitrate-laden foods in our food supply? Things like sausages, beef jerky, pepperoni, bacon, wrong bacon, school lunch meats, unfortunately, hot dogs, frozen pizza, any canned meats, hospital foods, I guess it's good for business, deli meats, and again, any frozen meat products often contain these nitrates. Next, we have HCAs, or heterocyclinamines. These are produced when we cook muscle at high temperatures, particularly if we grill or barbecue meats. Okay. And these are considered to be very potent mutagens, and in fact can pose a risk even at small, low levels. And this was a report published by the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, and they sampled different grilled meats. They found chicken to be the worst, likely because you have to cook chicken really well, followed by steak, pork, salmon, and hamburgers. All right, then we have things like obesity and glucose, or high elevated sugars. So consuming sugar obviously is a problem, as is consuming processed carbohydrates like white flour. And what it does, it stimulates the secretion of insulin. And elevated circulating levels of insulin is a risk factor for a number of different cancers. Okay? And then we have the heavy metals, such as methyl mercury. And I think most people know that these are found in fish, but they're also found in livestock. And part of the reason for this is that about a third of the fish that are caught are actually fed to livestock. And so as you go up the food chain, these contaminants become more concentrated. And so when you feed fish to livestock, you add another layer to that food chain. And if you eat fish that eat other fish, such as tuna, these fish are particularly worrisome because they do have significant levels of mercury. So mercury is produced in our environment when we burn coal for energy production. Another source of mercury, incidentally, is high fructose corn syrup. So another reason to avoid high fructose corn syrup. And then finally, we have saturated fat. And saturated fat, I think most people know, comes from mostly from animal sources. The biggest source of saturated fat in the American diet is cheese, followed by pizza, chicken products, beef, ribs, hamburgers, and so on. So apart from the carcinogenic content of these foods and the hormones, another problem with eating these foods is the type of protein. And particularly animal proteins are complete proteins. And we talk about these proteins as being high quality. So of course this sounds like a good thing. And in fact we have a very, very big reverence for these animal proteins. But the problem is the more complete the protein, the more they stimulate the production of insulin-like growth factor. And as we mentioned earlier, insulin-like growth factor can play a role in promoting some of that cancer cell division and tumor growth. So in this particular study, they compared 3 different types of ways of eating. Meat eaters compared to vegetarians, compared to vegans. What they found was that the vegetarians had similar levels to the meat eaters, likely because of the dairy that they consume. And the only group, of course, that had significantly lower levels were the vegans, vegans don't eat animal proteins, so they don't eat a lot of complete proteins. And they also measured something called insulin-like growth factor binding protein. And what this does, it binds to circulating levels of insulin-like growth factor and sort of removes it from circulation, so to speak, and keeps it from doing its damage. Okay? So insulin-like growth factor is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Too little is not good, but certainly too much is harmful as well. So higher levels of insulin-like growth factor are associated with increased aging, increased risk for diabetes, problems with dementia and Alzheimer's later in life, and also increased oxidative stress. And of course the biggest problem is that it can also be a cancer growth promoter. In fact, in one large-scale European study, increased levels of circulating IGF were associated with a 40% increased risk for a number of cancers after the age of 50. Okay. All right, so those are the compounds that are considered to be pro-carcinogenic, and I think the concern is that we ingest many of these substances on a daily basis, day in and day out, and even multiple times a day. And so this tends to add up and really increase the burden and can be, as we talked about, increase one's risk for cancer. So that ends part 1. In part 2, we're going to talk about foods that are chemoprotective, foods that can help slow cancer growth and reduce our risk.